Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
Huge interest, unsurprisingly, in our next guest. He's an old friend of mine. I've been chatting with him for a number of years. You read some life-changing books in your time. Well, several of his books have changed my life. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. He's a chief economist that has advised the World Bank, the UN, the IMF, Fortune 500 corporations and leaders of countries around the world. His book, The Confessions of an Economic Hitman, spent 73 weeks on the New York Times non-fiction bestseller list. It's been read around the world because it was translated into 32 languages. He's written many books. The Secret History of the American Empire, another outstanding read. Hoodwinked, another outstanding read. Go to his website, johnperkins.org. I advise you to go on to johnperkins.org. He recently published a new and revised edition of the groundbreaking Confessions book. It's called The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It's available to buy at all good online retailers. I can't recommend it enough. It's been updated with 12 new chapters. It's a real pleasure to welcome to the programme. And I think, just as I was welcoming him on, I think he's just dropped out on me. So let's see, can we get him back after all of that introduction? I think he is back now. Let's welcome to the show our friend John Perkins. John, welcome. How are you?
I'm great, Richie. Thank you. It's good to be with you again.
It's great, my friend. You're up to your eyes with work at the moment and appearances and everything. So I'm always delighted to get a chance to collar you for a short while. Meant everything I said in the introduction, John. Confessions of an Economic Hitman changed my life. It really did. I read it in late 2008 and I'd heard about you. I read the book. I read it 3 or 4 times in a week and spoke to you on the radio in Spain. We've since done TV and stuff like that. It's an amazing book, John, because it's not often that a book becomes more and more and more relevant with the passing of time. You know, it becomes more obvious that everything you talked about in the book not only has gone on historically, but it's going on now. Tell us about the new Confessions, the revised edition, and why you wanted to do that, and why it was important to update the book.
Well, really, Richie, I think the original book came out in about 12 years ago, 2004. And since then, things have changed a great deal. I think it's fair to say that the economic hitman system that I described as taking place primarily in the developing countries has now spread to Europe, England, the United States, and the rest of the world. And we have economic hitmen now hitting all of us. And also the jackals. We've really become much more of a police state. This is certainly true in the United States, and I think it's true in most of Europe and in the UK. But at the same time, people around the world are waking up to this fact. There's a lot of disclosures. The most recent have been the Panama Papers. And before that, we had Edward Snowden, we had WikiLeaks, and we've got Michael Moore out there doing all kinds of things. There's a lot going on. And so it seemed to me it was time to come up with a new version that updates what's happened in the last 12 or so years, and also to propose a strategy. I have lists, I have recommendations in there for something every one of your listeners can do to turn this around, to create a world that we're going to want to live in and our children are going to want to live in. And incidentally, Richie, I just want to say that some people ask, well, do I need to buy the original book before I read the new one? And the answer is no. The new one is an update of the old one with much more in it. Also, it's got a whole new section on what we need to do and what's happened in the last 12 years and so forth. So just buy the new one.
Absolutely.
If you read the old one, buy the new one because it gets so much information. And if you haven't read the old one, just go for the new one.
That's very good of you, John. Absolutely terrific. When I announced you were supposed to be back on, you were supposed to be on with us a couple of weeks ago, but I had a personal thing to take care of and we had to scrap the show. Thanks for your understanding, by the way. These things happen with these live shows. But that particular day, and even today, I was asked to ask you about the US intervention in the European Union referendum. Now, you and I have been talking since 2009, and we've often gotten into in our programmes how important to the cabal, how important these global trade deals are and how important decentralisation of power is. And again, folks, I'm not kissing John Perkins' ass here. I don't have to do that. This guy is outstanding. And he's written about these things in his books over the last 12, 13, 14 years in a way that is understandable for anybody, no matter what level you enter the conspiracy and you enter, trying to understand what's going on. It's absolutely amazing. John, most common question I was asked to put to you today, explain why it's so important to the private central bankers, why Britain stays within the European Union, despite all the evidence. As you've written about, and of course you've written about in the updated Economic Hitman book, what's happened to Greece and to Spain and to Portugal. Why is it so important for the cabal that the European Union project endures and that Britain stays in it?
Well, I think that there's even a larger question, that why is it important that the European Union continue to exist? Because I think if the UK drops out, that's the beginning of the end, or it's a continuation of the end, because I think the beginning to the end has already begun with Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal and Iceland and all that's going on. And so England, the UK becomes a key point here, kind of a keystone in all of this. If the UK goes, then a major part of the European Union goes, and it's deeper than that. It also has a huge impact on NATO, and the big corporations certainly want to see the UK held together. They love to have a common currency. It makes life a lot easier for them. They love to be able to trade the way that they do. And so, this whole thing around the trade agreements, TTIP and the other one, TPP, also will be very, very impacted if the UK drops out.
And of course, TTIP, as you quite rightly said there, is central to the plans of the banksters, isn't it, John? Because while we know that unofficially large corporations controlled by central banks, we know they're in charge anyway. But what TTIP is meant to do, and the TPP agreement, is to rubber stamp that, isn't it, and make it official once and for all.
Well, yeah, it codifies it into laws that haven't yet been codified, and the corporations may be acting that way, but this puts them in a much stronger position legally to have sovereign rights over sovereign countries within those countries.
It's amazing you've been on this week. Last week, we had Derek Hyde on talking about the Nazi roots of the Brussels EU, how major pharmaceutical companies, IG Farben and others, you know all this, John, it's not news to you, but just recapping for some of our listeners, how through the First and Second World War, they tried to create, a global centralised power structure, back in every side of everything, back in Hitler, back in everybody. These are the same people who tried to overthrow FDR back in 1933, but ultimately the European Union project was their way to bring about the centralisation of power in Europe. It's interesting today, John, to note we are going to come back now to the new Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and we are going to talk to John about solutions because he's been brilliant on this programme before, talking about moving away from a death economy to a life economy. We're going to get into some of that, some of the practical solutions we can do, but this is very important because this referendum on June 23rd is a huge opportunity, John, isn't it, for people in Britain. Even if people are worried about the fix, because we always worry about the fix, because these criminals can, of course, defraud elections. But even that notwithstanding, people need to get out and say, no, once and for all, we've had enough. We want out of this paradigm, out of this nonsense. Hugely important that British people engage, John, and exercise their franchise on June 23rd.
Well, yeah, I think, Richie, it's been very significant that England, UK has been fortunate in that it did not go with the euro, and we've seen how damaging that has been to countries like Greece and other European countries that have been involved in the euro. And I think that this serves a really important notice to the people in the UK.
Fantastic! I've got a terrific question from a friend of ours, Jean Ann Crowley. Huge fan of the book, Jean Ann is. And she says, Richie, Saudi Arabia and how the Saudis are feeling now given the 28 pages and their relationship with the United States. John's book is so good on the Saudis. She remembers the line, "No self-respecting Saudi would ever collect trash." That's the bit she remembers. John, how do you read that situation? You know, Obama, saying, well, we'll have to have a look at these 28 pages. People, of course, shouldn't confuse those 28 pages with the 9/11 Commission report. We must say that. But Obama is saying that we can't have a situation where US citizens could sue the Saudi government, because that would open us right up to us being sued as well. How are you reading this situation, John? I know you're watching it closely there.
You know, I have to say, Richie, I'm a little baffled. Actually, it's a very interesting situation that Obama would fly to Saudi Arabia and meet with the Saudis there, rather than asking or inviting them to come to Washington. It's symbolic, and you know, I'm not quite sure how to read it, to be honest with you. I'm surprised by him doing that, and it may be indicating solidarity around these 28 pages. I don't know what's in them. You don't know what's in them, but there's a very strong suspicion that, of course, it implicates the House of Saud, the royal family, strongly in some respect. We don't know the details.
It's fascinating, John, because it could have implications. It could have, it could result. I mean, I know some of our listeners are going to say this is stupid now. You know, Richie Allen's an idiot. We're never going to see this, but we might do, because Wayne Madsen was on the programme before you, John. Wayne was on in the first there. Wayne's a very good investigative journalist. You know all about Wayne. And Wayne said, Richie, look, this is the way it is. My sources are telling me that Prince Bandar is named. As you said, John, the House of Saud is named the King. And I said to Wayne, I said, what, Wayne? Are they named for providing material support? And he said, yes. But that has huge implications for George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, John Major, former British Prime Minister. These guys would have to go to prison, John.
Well, yeah, it has huge implications for the Bechtel family, the Bechtel Corporation, for Halliburton, for so many people. If, in fact, the Saudis are directly implicated in those activities, the implications are just huge. And yet that still doesn't explain why Obama would feel the need to go to Saudi Arabia. I just, unless he feels that somehow he can reduce the damages of this. It looks like, I mean, it seems now for the first time very likely that those 28 pages will come out in the public. Of course, it's very likely also that there'll be a lot of names and sentences redacted, blacked out. So even if the 28 pages come out, it may be that we are not able to learn names of actual people or even the families. It's very hard to know what's going on here. I mean, I think it's mysterious, and it's, you can only begin to imagine what's going on behind the scenes here, and what the CIA is doing and its involvement in all of this. It's one of those times it's fantastically interesting, mysterious, and enigmatic.
John Perkins is on the line, folks. 22 minutes past the hour. John's website is terrific, johnperkins.org. It's updated all the time. All sorts of really important information on there. We're chatting with John about the recent release of the new Confessions of an Economic Hitman, revised and updated with 12 new chapters. The original book, of course, spent 73 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and has sold over 1.25 million copies worldwide. It's fantastic. It opened up a lot of people's eyes as to how the cabal, how the central banks and the mega corporations operate, because John was there himself. It's an amazing story, John's personal story. It really is, and it's marvellous to have him on the programme. Martin Houston just tweeted to say he just bought a copy of the book. It's terrific, Martin. You're really going to enjoy it. John, talk to us about moving away from a death economy to a life economy. Now, I know the book has got loads of solutions and loads of practical solutions. That's what's marvellous about it. Tell us about it. What is a death economy? I know we can, for those of our listeners who haven't heard this before, how would you sum up a death economy? What's a life economy? And what can we do to move from one to the other? And how powerful could that be in terms of changing our paradigm and changing our lives?
Thanks, Richie. I think it's fair to say that that the world today is run by a death economy, and it's really an economy that we economic hitmen helped to create. It's an economy that's based on fear and debt. It's based on militarization, war or the threat of war, and also on destroying the very resources upon which it depends. And therefore, it's an economy that's really killing itself. It's killing resources and people, and it's killing itself ultimately. So it's not working. It's a failed system across the planet. Less than 5% of us live in the United States and consume almost 30% of the world's resources. That can't be repeated. China can't do that. They're trying, but they can't. Brazil can't do it. India can't do it. The numbers don't add up. So what we're looking at here is creating so there's two possibilities. This economy is just totally going to collapse, and we're all going to go back to living in caves. That's a bit allegorical, but we could have real collapse. Or the alternative is to transition into a life economy, and I think we could do that with a minimum amount of pain. In fact, it could be fun and interesting, exciting. And a life economy is an economy that's based on cleaning up pollution, paying companies that currently make military equipment to instead make equipment that'll mine all the plastic that's floating around out there in the oceans, and it will clean up all the oil spills all over the world, including at every major gas station in Europe and the United States and the rest of the world, and that will create new technologies for energy. Last year in the United States, we had more solar and other renewables built than fossil fuels. But we're still at a very archaic stage in solar and wind. There's huge developments that can happen and harnessing the energy of the air itself, like plants do. All kinds of new technologies for energy, transportation, communications. And in a life economy, these are the things you emphasize. And you emphasize methods and approaches that will alleviate the causes of poverty, of desperation, of violence, of terrorism. It will convince big agricultural corporations to get the hell out of business, turn it over to the small people, or at the very least, stop using toxic insecticides and fertilizers and start using organic things and helping starving people around the world to grow food more efficiently, organically, and store it and distribute it. There's such tremendous potential here for a new economy. And a lot of us are moving toward that. The emphasis on localization, on local farming, local banking, and so forth, and organics. And getting out of GMOs. There's a lot going on in this direction. So we just need to keep pushing for that.
It's marvelous stuff, John. And the thing is, it can begin with you personally. You can make choices and changes in your own day-to-day life, your own day-to-day existence, that can have a massive impact on the world around you without you even realising it. Because we often hear from people, and I will get this tomorrow, I will get a couple of mails and go, it's lovely to listen to John Perkins, but it's all very well him saying that, but what can I do? And people have to kind of extricate themselves or extract themselves from that mentality of what can I do? You can do lots. You can take part in local initiatives. You can, you can get an allotment from your local authority. You can grow your own vegetables on it. You spoke very eloquently last time you were on the programme and other times on other programmes about voting with your feet and voting with your wallet and refusing to spend money with companies who commit grievous crimes against humanity around the world. Everybody can make a difference, John.
I totally agree, and that's really one of the main reasons why I wrote the New Confessions of an Economic Hitman, to inspire and empower people to make a difference and to actually outline something everybody can do. There's a list in there of what students can do, what retired people can do, what everybody in between can do, what entrepreneurs can do, what business executives can do. There's something in there for everyone, and I think what's most important is for us to understand that this current system is run by big corporations, much more than by governments. The corporations really pull the strings in your government, my government, most governments. But we control the corporations, really, if we come right down to it. We, the people, the corporations depend on us to buy their goods and services, to invest in them, to work for them, to manage them, and to support them through tax dollars and government policies. We need to understand that these corporations are not inherently evil or bad. They're just groups of people They're a perception. They're a perceived reality. And perceived reality always impacts objective reality. And we can change perceived reality. So these corporations are all run, and this is recent, that they've run under a single goal that says they need to maximize profits regardless of social and environmental costs. That came out of 1976 when Milton Friedman won the Nobel Prize in economics by basically stating that. But before that, there was also a whole component of corporations needing to serve the public, to do good deeds, to be good citizens. That changed in 76. And that was a time in 1976 when we had a very different view of the world. We thought that capital was scarce and nature was abundant. Nobody was talking about peak oil or climate change, but that's all changed. And so we need to change now and let these corporations know that their goal no longer is to maximize profits. It's to make a decent rate of return for people who will invest in creating a life economy, because we need investments in that. But beyond that, everything should be oriented toward that life economy, towards serving a public interest, of making a world that we and our children and grandchildren and around the world of all species will be happy to inherit.
I've had an email from Alan, and we're a democratic radio program, so we'll put out all the nice emails and tweets, but we'll put out the critical ones as well. Dare I say, says Alan, and I'm a big fan of John's, is he a little bit naive? Because the globalists and the elite, they just won't allow it, will they? They won't allow us to start to rise up against them. And maybe they'll use a major financial collapse, and maybe that's what it will take before a large number of people are forced to wake up. They will push back, John, won't they? And they push back through their I mean, it's so disgusting. You and I have been talking about this since 2009. You've been awake and alert to what's going on far longer than I have. And it's just tyrannical. You know, we learn just over the weekend that, you know, more human rights groups in America are coming out to say that the FBI are actually behind a lot of the so-called domestic terror plots, and the FBI are putting young Muslims, they're luring them with honey traps, and they're trying to lure them into these terror plots so that they can swoop in and scare the American people. These are the worst bastards, John, you know, in history, in living memory. And they are going to push back, these people, aren't they?
Well, there's certainly going to be pushback, but I think we also have to be careful not to get too discouraged or too pessimistic or too paranoid. Because, you know, we can make tremendous progress. We've seen that in the past. You know, we got rid of apartheid in South Africa by boycotting corporations that supported it. And recently, Iceland stood up to the big banks by refusing to pay off its loans and putting bankers in prison. In the United States just recently, a small state with less than 0.2% of the United States population, Vermont, 0.2% of the U.S. population, a small fraction of that small state forced Vermont to pass a law making the food companies label GMOs. And as a result, the five biggest companies in the United States, food companies, General Mills, Kellogg's, Mars, Campbell's Soup, and ConAgra, all announced that they're going to label GMOs in every state, nationally, all over the United States, because a small group of people here. And we've seen tremendous things happening around the world today, changes. You're experiencing those in the United Kingdom. We the people have the power. And if people get discouraged or they get too pessimistic or too paranoid, that they feel that they can't do anything, then the opposition has won. Then those in power, the status quo wins. And yes, the status quo doesn't want change. The people that are already making lots of money, they don't want to change that. Or actually, some of them recognize that the system isn't working. I speak at a lot of corporate summits and conferences, and I always ask, why do CEOs invite me to speak to them?
Yeah. You of all people, John.
Yeah. And the answer I get is that CEOs are pretty smart for the most part, and they understand that the system isn't working, that we cannot continue with an economy that's consuming itself into extinction, that's destroying the very resource base it depends upon. They get this, and they say, but we don't know what to do. We're afraid that if we, the ones that say, I'd like to do the good things, But if I do, I'm afraid I'll lose a little bit of market share. And if I lose a little bit of market share, my main stockholders will fire me and replace me with someone who
yeah.
market share. And so they say, hey, get your people, your listeners, to send emails to my company saying, I love your product, Nike or whatever the company is, Walmart, whatever it is. I love your products, but I'm not going to buy them anymore until you pay your workers a fair wage.
Brilliant, John.
The cause is. And you know, we have the power, especially with social media today. Let's not get discouraged. Let's take action. Let's organize.
Yeah, nothing was ever done by saying, I can't do anything. Historically, that's absolutely right. Luke is listening from sunny Lisbon today and is enjoying listening to John Perkins. Luke, thanks very much for your tweet. Zana is listening in New Zealand. Please ask at economic_hitman. That's the way we're talking these days, John, with all the social media stuff, you know.
Yeah, well, that's also my Twitter.
That's right. That's your Twitter handle. Yeah. You can follow John at economic_hitman. Please ask John to specifically comment on the fact that New Zealand has a multi-millionaire Forex trader as Prime Minister. Of course, that's the Right Honourable John Key. How can a guy like that end up as Prime Minister? Basically is what Zana is asking. John.
Well, it's obvious. We may very well have something similar in this country with Trump if he gets elected. Who knows? But let's face it: the wealthy are in positions to get elected. But let's also understand that our elected officials, there's a symbolism there, but they're not really all that powerful. The big corporations control them, and so we've got to understand that it's not just enough to vote. It's not just enough to get really involved in elections. It's appalling how the United States has been so caught up for almost, will have been 2 years almost by the time the election happens here, with this presidential election. It's a distraction. It makes a huge amount of money for the media, but it's a distraction. And people get to thinking, well, whether it's in New Zealand or the United States, well, if only my person gets elected, everything will be okay. But if the opposition gets elected, I'll just go into hibernation. I won't do anything. There's nothing I can do anyway. And I think that's what's happened to a lot of people in New Zealand recently, vis-a-vis your listener. What we need to understand is that most all of these politicians are really controlled by big corporations. Even the ones that don't accept money from the corporations themselves are surrounded by people who do, and by politicians who whose campaigns are either financed by corporations or who understand that when they leave office, they will get extremely lucrative jobs as consultants and lobbyists. They are controlling government. And we need to understand that. And we need to understand that the best way, one of the best ways to change government policies is to convince corporations that they need to change government policies, like the example I used with GMOs here in the United States, where these companies were convinced that they had to change the GMO policy. And again, we've seen something similar with apartheid. We've seen terribly polluted rivers cleaned up in the United States and Europe because we've pressured companies. We've seen corporations open their doors wider to women and minorities because we forced them to do that. We can create these changes. Now we have to ratchet this up a notch and say we're only going to support corporations that are supporting a life economy. We get out of this mentality of maximizing profits regardless of the social and environmental costs, and get into a mentality that says that their main job is to serve the public.
Brilliant. John, we've got another 10 minutes on this, and we're bombarded with questions. We really are. There's a lovely question, a very poignant question from Mark Cox on email. Mark, thanks very much. Richie, really enjoying the show. Please ask John, does he miss the ones taken out? And I think he's referring to people like Omar Torrijos. Yeah, I mean, yeah. You do, John, don't you? You do. I mean, you can explain what he means by that question better than I can. Go ahead.
Well, I assume the same, that he's referring to Jaime Roldos of Ecuador, Omar Torrijos of Panama, who were both clients of mine and both of whom I had tremendous respect for because they had integrity. They wouldn't buy into the deals that I was trying to get them to buy into. It was my job to corrupt them. In essence, they wouldn't be corrupted. Put me in a very difficult position because it was my job to corrupt them. If they weren't corruptible, then I wasn't doing my job right. But also, these were men who I respected tremendously for their integrity. And I knew that if they didn't play my game, eventually something bad would happen to them. They'd be overthrown or assassinated. Both Roldos and and Torrijos were assassinated by CIA assets. And you can go to the CIA website and see that the CIA website, recent declassified information, the CIA has had to admit that it was involved in the overthrow or assassination of President Arbenz of Guatemala, President Allende of Chile, Prime Minister Mossadegh of Iran, Prime Minister Diem of Vietnam, and Lumumba of the Congo, and so many others. I mean, these are things we've admitted to. This is not speculation. This is not a conspiracy theory. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. This isn't part of that. These are facts. And the United States government has been deeply involved in this. And yes, do I miss some of these? Yeah, Torrijos and Roldos were amazing, heroic figures. And I'm very sad by what happened to them. But it also inspired me to get the hell out of this business and to spend the rest of my life trying to expose and change it.
Question I was asked to put to you when I announced you were coming on a couple of weeks back, and I've just remembered it now. And it was about the former Venezuelan president, Hugo Chavez, rest in peace. Was Chavez somebody whom was, if he had been left alone, if external influences trying to undermine him and overthrow him, is he a perfect example of somebody who was getting it right for his people and would have done extraordinary things in South America if it wasn't for interference by the agents of the globalists? How do you feel about Chavez?
Well, I have very mixed feelings about Chavez. I would say, first of all, there's no question that he changed history, especially the history of Latin America, but in a way, all history. When he stood up to the CIA in 2002, the CIA tried to overthrow him. And he was smart enough to stand up to them and to remain in power. He was overthrown for less than 48 hours. And anyway, there's a long story behind that, but he was very successful. And after that, the Bush administration didn't go in and try to take him out with a military maneuver, probably because they were overextended in the Middle East and knew that our oil companies relied on Venezuelan oil, especially as war erupted in the Middle East. But because Chavez was able to stand up to the CIA, he showed the U.S. as a paper tiger. And as a result of that, 10 countries in Latin America suddenly moved from brutal dictatorships, which they'd had for most of my lifetime, a lot of them put into power and supported throughout by the CIA. They moved from that to democratically elected presidents, most of them fairly progressive. They run the gamut, from people like Morales of Bolivia and Correa of Ecuador to the government of Nicaragua, and so there was a tremendous variety among these different groups. But Chavez was the leader, and because he resisted the CIA, he changed history. On the other hand, I think he made a lot of mistakes as president, as an administrator. He did not set up a good system that after his death was able to continue. So
he didn't have the sophistication, John, did he?
No, and the country's really fallen apart since his death. Had he been a really good administrator, a good manager, a good leader, he would have set a system in place that could have continued after his death. So, there's two sides. There's are with so many people. He was heroic, he changed history, and I'd have to give him a pretty low grade as an administrator.
Loads of questions. Just got a few more minutes left with John, folks. Dave Parkin says 1,000-mile walk starts with one step. That's a wonderful sentiment, Dave, because everybody can make a difference, mate. You're absolutely right there. Richard Angelis makes an interesting point in a question on Twitter. Thanks, Richard. Is the solution that we move our economic transactions and savings to secure wallets with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin? Now, before John answers that, I'm going to be honest and say that I personally, and it's just my opinion, and I'm certainly not important, I worry about the cashless society, and I think Bitcoin is basically another arm of the agenda to push us towards a cashless society. So I don't like it, but I'm not going to argue with anybody, and we all have our opinions. John, what do you think cryptocurrencies?
Well, first of all, I think the current Federal Reserve System, the central reserve system, central banking system is terribly wrong. We need to change it. It needs to go out of that kind of ownership by a few wealthy people. You know that story you talk about a lot, Richie. But
Yeah.
I don't think this kind of computerized currency is the answer. Like you, it's dangerous. It's a little bit like computerized voting, which we now have in the state of the United States where I live, Washington. I know I talked to a lot of experts. There's all kinds of opportunities here to break into that system, to control it in many ways. And I think the same would be true of any kind of digitalized currency. So I think we have to be very, very careful about that. Yes, let's change the Federal Reserve central banking system as it stands today in the United States and throughout so much of Europe and so much of the world. But let's be careful about how we change it.
Brilliant. Rhonda is in Canada. And she's wondering what John, whose Twitter is at economic_hitman, by the way. Just before I read Rhonda's comment, John's website is johnperkins.org. I've tweeted that out a couple of times. And the new Confessions of an Economic Hitman, the updated, revised edition of one of the most amazing books I've ever had the pleasure to read. It completely changed my life. There's a couple of them. I mentioned David's 9/11 book, hugely important. Confessions of an Economic Hitman, equally important to me. That's available at all good online retailers. The new Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Rhonda says, we have touched on this, but it is important because TTIP is so imminent. Rhonda says, wondering what John thinks about TTIP and TPP possibly reversing the progress made against corporations like Monsanto. I know you've touched on that already, but it's a big deal, John, for our listeners, TTIP in particular, because of the implications for us, because it drives standards down, it makes jobs disappear, and it basically cedes control to these corporations. Another quick word on TTIP, my friend.
Well, TTIP and TPP are disasters. We don't want them.
Yeah.
That's the quick word. We've seen in the United States what CAFTA and NAFTA have done in Central America, destroying the economies of Central America. What we call the U.S. immigration problem is caused by NAFTA and CAFTA to a very large degree. If we get TTIP and TPP, we're going to have all of that on a much, much larger and much more dangerous scale.
Absolutely right. 15 minutes to the top of the hour. Just for the last 2-3 minutes, John. What's always very obvious to me, what shines through whenever we chat, and we probably speak every 6 or 8 months, probably, we have done for a few years, is that there's an unbelievable shining optimism. Not unbelievable, wonderful shining optimism that comes through you whenever I hear you. And I listen to you talk to other programs and presenters as well. I always look out for you. You are completely convinced that the empire of decay and the death economy is in terminal decline, and what's coming for us is going to be something wonderful and spectacular and life-changing and beautiful, really. You're convinced of it, John.
Well, I'm convinced that the empire is in decline. I'm convinced that people are waking up to change it. I'm not convinced 100% that we're going to make something beautiful, but I am convinced that we have a tremendous opportunity to do it. And it's going to take us doing it. And it's fun. This is a revolution, but we don't have to pick up guns. This is a revolution that can be done through social networking, through programs like yours, Richie, through books like mine and television and movies like Michael Moore makes, and so on and so forth. It's a fun revolution. We should all get involved. Every one of your listeners should play a role. And my book outline, my new Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and my website, as you mentioned, I encourage people to sign up for my newsletter. They actually have to put their email in the little box up there. This spells out ways that we can do these things and really have fun doing it. This can be a fun revolution. So I'm totally convinced that the opportunity is here, and I'm convinced that we are going to do it. But I also know that we have to get in there and take the actions and enjoy doing it. And I think this is a blessed time to be alive.
Brilliant. And just finally, because you've given me an idea there, and one or two of our listeners have actually put it to me to ask you. Are you a man of faith, John? Do you believe that ultimately there is a benevolent and a greater, higher power that might also be, looking out for us or working on our behalf?
I grew up in a very Christian household, and then I lived with the indigenous people a lot in the Amazon, the Andes, and many other places. And what I really believe is that there is a deep spirit, that the universe has a tremendous spiritual power, and that everything here is invested with spirit. I go jogging in forest near my home every day, just about, and feel the spirit of the trees, of the land, of the universe. So yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily believe that that we're made in God's image. That there's a great being up there that has a long beard and reaches down with a hand like the Sistine Chapel painting. But I totally believe that it's an organized, it's a spiritual universe. We're spiritual beings here on this planet, come here to do something remarkable. And we need to honor that, and we need to feel that connection, that spirit. Yes, I totally believe that it's a benign universe, and it's a universe that's evolving. And human beings are a huge part of that evolutionary force if we choose to be. But we must move in that direction.
Folks, the new Confessions of an Economic Hitman is fantastic. If you haven't read Confessions, as John said, to his credit, he said you don't have to buy that. Check out the new Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It's available at all good online retailers. You'll find it in your local bookstore as well. John's website, where you can sign up for his newsletter. It won't cost you anything. johnperkins.org. Mate, love chatting to you. More than you'll ever know. I think you're doing amazing work. And thanks for it. Thanks for the sacrifices you make. Look after yourself. Keep safe. And I look forward to talking to you later on in the year.
Thank you, Richie, and keep up your great work. And all your listeners out there, I really encourage you to all take action. Get with it, have fun, and join the dance.
Fantastic, my friend. The great John Perkins, thanks again. Live on the line to us there from Oregon.